All right, it's time for graphing. You guys should have known that this was going to come. Every single time we do something in Algebra 2, we always end up graphing it. Now, I'm just going to keep this to the simpler side since you guys are basically just teaching this to yourself at home. So um, there are more complicated versions of this, but I'll leave that for when you move on to trigonometry or advanced topics next year. So before we jump into graphing sine and cosine, um, we're just gonna focus on the key features of the graph that you can figure out just by looking at the functions. So basically just the algebra part of it before you graph, like the prep. So whenever you have sine and cosine graphs, there's two key features that we're gonna focus on. So two key features, and those key features that we're going to focus on are the what's called amplitude and the period. Now, for today, these will be a little bit out of context because I'm not really going to explain what these are. I'm just going to show you how to find them. But the next lesson, when I show you how to graph, that's where I'll explain what these are. Basically, amplitude is how tall the graph is. The period is going to be how often the graph is going to repeat, basically. But that won't make sense until you see it. But anyway, so your parent functions for sine and cosine would just be y equals sine x or y equals cosine x. That'd be your most basic one. Now for these are the templates for the more complicated graphs that have changes made to them. So what you're going to focus on when you're looking at these two graphs are these key features of amplitude and period. So first is we're going to start with A, which is basically just whatever number is in front of the sine or cosine. So A is going to be what you're going to use to find your amplitude. Your amplitude is going to be equal to the absolute value of A. So if you remember, those two bars mean absolute value. Now, what does absolute value do to a number? Well, if you have like absolute value of 7, it's just 7, let's say, for example. But let's say you have the absolute value of negative 15, the absolute value of negative 15 is positive 15. So basically just makes everything positive. So what that means is that, just as a note for yourself, this means that the amplitude is always positive. Is always positive, no matter what. It's always going to be a positive number. No matter if the equation or function has a negative number in front of sine or cosine, it's always going to be positive. All right. So that's how you find the amplitude. Then whatever number b is what you're going to use to find your period of the function. Now, to find the period, you use a formula. So the formula is 2 pi divided by whatever number b is. So, you know, I'm always making you memorize things, so make sure you memorize this formula. It's always a 2 pi. It's never like 4 pi or 3 pi. It's always 2 pi. The reason why it's 2 pi is because 2 pi, if you change that to degrees, would be 360 degrees, which normally would be a full rotation, but we're going to be doing things that do a full rotation in less than 360 degrees. So amplitude is positive the number in front of the sine or cosine is positive, change it to positive. Period is 2 pi divided by whatever number b is. That's for sine, and the same thing applies for cosine. So A is going to be your amplitude, which for now I'll just abbreviate to amp, and B is the number that you plug into the formula to find your period. All right. So we're just going to practice finding those two key features for a couple different problems. Okay, so the first one, these are the easier ones, a little bit easier. So you're finding the amplitude and period. You are not graphing these yet. Okay, so I have y equals 2/3 sine 8x. So first let's start with the amplitude. So remember that the number in front of sine or cosine is a, the number that's in front of the x is b. So then the amplitude is where you take the absolute value of a. So we're taking the absolute value of 2/3. Basically, if it's positive, it stays positive. If it's negative, it turns positive. So amplitude is just going to be 2/3. And you'll be able to do that just by looking at it. I'm just going to write it out just because I'm showing you for the first time. Then for the period, that's where you have to use the formula. So the period is going to be, remember it's 2 pi, always 2 pi, nothing different, divided by whatever number b is. So it'd be 2 pi divided by, I'll write out 2 pi divided by b, which would give you 2 pi divided by 8. And then for these, you have to simplify the fraction. So that means that this would simplify to be 2/8. Divide both of those numbers by 2 would give you 1/4. So 1 pi over 4, which if you simplified it, just cleaned it up to make it look nicer, would just be pi over 4. So there you go. That's how you find the amplitude and the period. All right, so let me do another one. This one's a cosine, but the steps don't change. So from before, a is whatever the number is in front, and b is the number that's with the x. So I'll start with amplitude again. So for the amplitude, that's going to be the absolute value of a. Well, wait a second. Okay, so there's no number here, right? What are you supposed to assume if there's no number in front of a sine or no number in front of a cosine? It's the same thing as if there's no number in front of an x. If there's nothing, you assume it's a 1. So you're going to take the absolute value of 1. Guess I had to write that a little bit different so that it doesn't look like another line. So the absolute value of 1 is just 1. So that's the amplitude. Okay, and then the period. Again, you have to memorize that formula. Though I guess since you're just taking tests at home, you don't really have to memorize it, but in the future you will. So it's going to be 2 pi divided by b. Well, in this case, we have that b is a half, so nothing that we have to figure out there. So I will do 2 pi divided by a half. Now, just to keep this easy, we'll just change a half to be 0.5. So 2 pi over 0.5. And then you just divide 2 divided by 0.5 on a calculator, and your calculator will give you that is equal to 4. So your final answer is 4, and then just carry the pi symbol. There's your answer. There's a long way of dividing this without changing it to a decimal, but for now, for this one was an easy fraction, so I'll just leave it as I'll change it to a decimal and divide. Okay, so that's finding amplitude and period kind of at the easy level. These second examples are going to be a little bit more difficult than those, so just more involved basically. So same steps as before. A is going to be whatever number's in front of sine or cosine. B is a number with the x. So then the amplitude is going to be the absolute value of A, so the absolute value of -7. Remember, absolute value just takes positive. If it's a positive number, it stays positive. If it's a negative, it makes it positive. So -7 will change to +7. That's the amplitude. The period, use the formula. So 2 pi, that was an ugly 2, 2 pi divided by b. So in this case, b is 2 pi divided by 2/3. Now, you would have to, if you were going to do the same thing as before, you would change 2/3 to be a decimal. Now, that decimal is not as nice as a half because that decimal keeps repeating. So it'd be 0.6 repeating. So it'd just keep going on forever, right? And then when you divide 2 divided by 0.6 repeating, you'll get something really close to 3, but it's not exactly 3, but it's supposed to be 3 pi. Now, I'm going to show you how to work this out the actual way with fractions. At this point, since you're at home, just choose what you're more comfortable with. I'm not going to force you to use fractions. Though if we were in a classroom, you guys know I would hold you to keeping it to fractions. But anyways, so to do this using fractions, you would keep the 2 pi exactly how it is. And then remember, we don't divide by a fraction. What we do is keep, change, flip. So it'd be keep the 2 pi, change it from division to multiplication, and then you're going to flip the 2/3 to be upside down, so 3/2. Then you would do it this way, and then put the 2 pi over 1, the same way you make anything into a fraction, and then multiply left to right. So 2 pi times 3 is going to be 6 pi, and 1 times 2 is 2. Divide it, and you get 3 pi. I would prefer that you use this method, but obviously at this point it's just get whatever you can get, you know. So whatever you're more comfortable with. You should still get this right around the same answer, even if you do the decimal. All right, so last example is 3 cosine 16x. So like before, amplitude is whatever number's in front, so A, and the period is, you use a formula, but we're going to be using the 16 in the formula. So amplitude, which I've been abbreviating as amp, so that would be the absolute value of 3. 3 is already positive, so it stays positive. Then the period, you use the formula, 2 pi divided by b. So in this case, it's 2 pi divided by 16. And then when it's a fraction, you have to simplify it. So simplify by dividing by 2 on the top and bottom. And you'll get the simplified answer of 1 pi over 8, which cleaned up is just pi over 8. All right, guys, so there you go. That's how you find amplitude and period. The next lesson is going to be actually using these in order to graph sine and cosine. So here's your homework. Same as always. Do your homework on a piece of paper, take a picture of it, and submit it on Edsby. If you have any questions, as always, just send me a message. I will respond to it as soon as I can.